So everyone, welcome to our Patreon live interview for September 18th, 2022. With us today is Professor Paul Roberge from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we actually met, I was fondly recalling this, we met for the first time in April at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, close to my heart because of my spending time there for my master's degree. And that was a great conference.
It sure was.
You were among many fine friends that I made or reconnected with there. And I took an interest in your interest in subjects such as Creoles and the history of Afrikaans, in particular, the question of whether it might be a Creole. Now, for people who might not have as much background in this, could you explain what we mean in the study of languages when we talk about a Creole?
Sure. Jackson, I prepared a couple PowerPoint.
Oh, sure.
I have a chronic habit of over preparing.
That's fine. You are co-host, so you can screen share.
Oh, I may. Is that all right? Would that be okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. I won't present the whole thing, but what I want to do is present just some basic definitions on pidgins,
okay,
Creoles. Cool. And then I also have something on Afrikaans if that's of interest too. So we can take it however you want. So let's hope this works.
Well, by the way, while you pull that up, I was recalling I took a class in Creoles at the University of Georgia with Professor Bautista. I don't know if she's still there or not.
I don't know. I don't know the name, to be honest with you. Probably not.
Yeah, I don't remember. But you know, she got me pretty interested in the work of Salikoko Mufwene, and I've read several articles by him and his book, The Ecology of Language Evolution, with great interest.
Oh yeah, no, I know that book very, very well.
It's actually really this sounds like I'm making something up for the back of a book jacket or something, but it's actually pretty riveting reading. I mean, it's just he makes it really fascinating. So anyway, recommended book on my part.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, definitely. Let's see, here we go. Let me see if I can get this back. Sorry, just a little bit. All right, I will try to. I do agree with you on the book. Actually, it's a collection of his articles. I've got it here and consult it very, very frequently. And I follow, in many respects, his views on what a Creole language is, and you'll recognize that soon. So, okay, let me just see if I can share this. Let's see. Try this here. Can you see that, Jackson?
Yep.
Everybody else okay? All right.
Let's see. I'll wait to hear from one of the audience members to make sure. Yep, they can see it. All right.
Okay, great, fantastic. All right. I'm just going to go right to the heart of the matter. First of all, what a pidgin is. The term pidgin, conventionally, or let's say the consensus is that this is the OED, a Chinese corruption. That's not quite the word I would use of English. Business, maybe derivable from two Chinese characters. I'm not sure about the tones here, but pidgin, paying money. Whatever the first instantiation of pidgin as a word in this spelling here comes from Canton or Guangzhou in China, and would be part of Chinese Pidgin English, which is now extinct. Here's the working definition I would offer as a pidgin: the linguistic creation of a new contact community that has need for a common means of communication but does not share a common language. Alternatively, we could consider it an auxiliary contact vernacular for interethnic communication when two or more groups speaking mutually unintelligible and typologically rather different languages have to communicate and they have no common language. You can put yourself in this kind of situation if you travel, as I'm sure many people have here who are hearing this. you go to a place where you don't speak the language, you try to communicate with your interlocutors, think back about what you did, and you can ponder that. These two images here are from Otawara, Japan. My wife, Anne, whom you met, Jackson, in Athens, you may remember, she went there to visit her brother, and she got out of the train station and realized, not only do I not understand Japanese, I am now illiterate. There's nothing to go on. So that's kind of the situation people, again, depending, are in. And so you try to use just, whatever words you can pick up out of the language that's in use. And if you can't figure that out, you try using your own words, from your own language, or accompany these minimal articulations with gestures. Okay, so basically it's pragmatically based, and you're sort of making it up as you go along. Well, that's on an individual basis. I previewed a video of yours, Jackson, when you're talking about alterity, the other. Do you remember that one? I know you've done thousands of videos.
It's hard for me to
this
know.
one,
I've talked
I know it is. It just occurred to me that's it, because I had just seen it. You did mention a couple of things. This inspires this part here. A typical pidgin situation might be, in Greenland during the Norse colonization, between the Greenland Norse, speaking some variety or varieties of Old Norse, obviously, and the Inuit, the indigenous people, living in separate settlements, different cultures, different traditions, radically different languages. And again, little doubt that there was a very robust interaction between these groups, even though they obviously remain quite separate. In this kind of situation, it is very likely that a trade jargon, which is sort of the earliest stages of the pidgin, this is where we have, as I mentioned in the Otawara example, people deploying their own individual solutions to the problem of inter-ethnic communication. So everyone's kind of doing what they can, and there are no established norms of any kind, and basically some sort of minimal communication, along with maybe silent barter, might arise. Well, no question that this was very much an arm's length kind of affair, which it often is. I work on early pidgin formation in South Africa when the Europeans came to the Cape of Good Hope. And I have documented out of mariners' memoirs and diaries, basically the same kind of thing. Trying to use words, individual words to affect trade. I will trade you this bracelet for that sheep or whatever. And oftentimes silent barter. So the situation in between European and indigenous contexts in Southern Africa would be, no different in principle from this situation here. Jackson, I don't know if you know this book. There's an anthology that came out about language contact in the Arctic area. And I can give you the source if you don't remember it. Peter Trudgill's got a really good article in here, among others. There's another attempt at a reconstruction of a pidgin in Archangel, however that's pronounced in Russian, there. And then there's one article here on the on Greenland, and in this a huge article. It's hundreds some odd pages long, but there are sporadic loan words in Inuktitut that may be the legacy, well, certainly of the Norse presence, but possibly also in the possibly reminiscent of the very basic trade jargon in Greenland, which is of course now gone. The word skraling, Greenlander, Angelica, which is a plant name, and here's the Old Norse, sort of standard Old Norse form. The word for porpoise, gnisa, and the word for carrot. Okay, these survive here too. So possibly, certainly borrowings, but possibly may have come in through a rudimentary trade pidgin. Another thing you mentioned in your video, which struck me, I was thinking of this myself, was of course the linguistic encounters between the Norse and the Native Americans in Vinland. And in the Saga of the Greenlanders, the Skrælings, the indigenous Native Americans, First Nations people, we don't know exactly the identity, come out of the woods and, quote, neither side could understand the other's language. So this is, again, a very arm's length transition, very tense, people not trusting each other. And the people whom the Norse call the Skrælings, and I know you in your same video, you talk about that, Jackson. They first want weapons, and of course, Thorfinn Karlsefni says, no, we're not going to do that. Then they trade for milk, and then they come back later, and cloth seems to be the desired item. And of course, the bull bellows, and the indigenous people, the indigenes, scatter. But what they have to offer in return are quite valuable, furs, sables, and pelts. And again, here, this also is very reminiscent of the earliest encounters between Europeans and indigenous people in Southern Africa. Again, here, sort of luxury items for staples, and that will be, probably work against those. No, definitely work against those people, but we'll move on here too. So at any rate, there's no language, so that's another kind of situation where a pidgin might develop, but here it didn't, because the contact was too brief. The the Norse didn't stay very long, and so there was no particular incentive, unlike in Greenland, okay, where there might have been kind of a pidgin, and very definitely in Southern Africa where one arose. You may remember in Eric's saga, later on, Thorfinn and his party capture these, I think it was about 7 or 8 people. 2 of them are boys, and they just scattered the others, took the 2 boys captive and taught them their language, and baptized or prime signed them. And the boys tell about their background and all that. That seems to me wildly implausible. What may have developed here is, again, a sort of jargon, if this happened at all, sort of jargonized forms of Norse that they were able to deal with. So at any rate, pidgin, again here, the first question, okay, why didn't your own makeshift efforts? If you're dropped in Odawara, you don't speak Japanese, you don't read it, you try to wing it. Again here, why doesn't this happen? Well, again here, you're a transient, you're a native population, you're one individual, and so you're a jargonized form, your very rudimentary attempt, is just going to be very ephemeral. Pidgins are group solutions to the problem of interethnic communication. So, okay, they require groups of people, and they basically, these speakers who use their jargons, basically negotiate a highly variable but socially accepted norm or set of norms. And so what results is a very restricted linguistic system. I use the term restricted advisedly here, because these are not failed attempts at learning a language or partial attempts. People are constructing a language, but this language here does not fulfill all of the functions that a normal human language would do. These people use their native varieties, their native languages, first languages, 95% of the time. They have no interest in learning anybody else's language. Nobody cares whether the emerging pidgin conforms to any established norms. The sole purpose is to get the communicative needs taken care of in a limited number of domains. So just trade, as in the previous example, and maybe not much more than that, or work. So at any rate, excuse me, I'll go through. Jackson, is this too much information, or should I just continue a little bit?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Let me remind patrons they can throw in questions as you proceed, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay. So, yeah, continue.
Okay. So I'll just go a quick rundown of social situations that are likely to produce pidgins, and then I'll go to Creole, if that would be okay.
Yep.
Okay. So at any rate, as you can see, here is the sort of slave triangle. Well, it's not the complete triangle, but representation of European enslavement of Africans and importing them here to the New World. It is claimed, controversially, that early cohorts of enslaved Africans acquired or let's say developed a pidgin based on the European language of the slave traders and slave owners. So this would be, and then that pidgin, or these pigeons, let's say, were brought to the Caribbean, to North America and South America. So there'd be a New World Pidgin Portuguese, Pidgin English, Pidgin French, Pidgin Dutch, Pidgin Spanish. 4 of these eventually would develop into Creole languages. But first things first, people have to, pidginize. This is the traditional view of the pidgin to Creole life cycle. So slave labor situations, let's say, would be one potential situation where pidgin languages would arise. Indentured or contract labor situations involving multinational, multilingual people on labor contracts, working for a time and then going back. One case would be town Bemba in Zambia, what was then known as Zambia, where we are here, town Bemba right here, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known today. Another would be Fanakalo in South Africa. That's a Zulu-based pidgin, meaning most of the words are from Zulu, but elements of English, Afrikaans, and other languages are present there. That would be spoken in the mines, the platinum, the gold, and the asbestos mines in Southern Africa. It is actually taught. You can buy little grammars of Fanakalo. I've got a video I show my students of a mining foreman teaching workers Fanakalo. Very low prestige, again, because the occupation of mining has traditionally been very low prestige, very dangerous work. And again, the workers come from all over Southern Africa, and not just within the Republic of South Africa, but all the way around here. It's very dangerous work. Another situation where a pidgin might arise would be if you have, this is more typical of the Pacific than of the so-called New World, but plantations that made use of indentured labor, once again on labor contracts, not enslaved. Oftentimes the difference, other than the legal difference, might be minimal, pretty exploitative situations. But places like Hawaii, for example, the pineapple and sugar plantations had workers from all over China, Japan, the Philippines, Korea, speaking many, many different languages. And what arose there was both a pidginized version of English and a pidginized version of Hawaiian. Okay. Also in Melanesia, one of the most diverse linguistic areas of the world, German and English-speaking plantation owners set up their plantations and imported people from all over Melanesia to work there. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay, what else here? Military pidgins, where you have, say, Arabic-speaking officers and African conscriptees or enlistees speaking many, many different languages. For example, Juba Arabic, spoken up here near the Sudan, which is now an extended pidgin today. Another kind of social situation would be in European colonies where people in the service of Europeans, whether in domestic servants or in colonial offices, might have pidginized. And I say might because there's some debate whether these are actually pidgins or just interlanguage varieties of English or French. That would have been in Indochina when that was a French colony. Butler English in India. That's the rather pejorative name they gave. There was one in the German Pachtgebiet. What's that? Trade colony, let's say trade city. They call it Kiaochou, Qingdao in modern in China today. Very fragmentarily attested German lexified pidgin, which is, of course, like the others, now extinct. Some people have said that foreign worker German and other foreign worker varieties in Europe are pidgins or were pidgins among the first generation of workers. I do not agree with that, but that has been claimed. What else? You'll notice here I've been going from the least voluntary to rather more voluntary situations. There are trade and maritime situations among more or less equals. One would be the so-called lingua franca. And that's a Mediterranean pidgin lexified by, depending on where you are here, Italian, or maybe Provence, or maybe a little more Portuguese, Spanish over here, but nonetheless, once used from the Levant all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar, Northern Africa in trade, that is now extinct. I have to mention, Jackson, given your background, Russo-Norsk, that is the Russo-Norwegian trade language used in maritime, and particularly the fisheries, or fishing trade between Russian traders and Norwegian fishermen. This is a dual source pidgin of these two languages, but there were words from Sami, Low German, all other kinds of words here too. That went extinct after the trade stopped, after the Bolshevik Revolution. I won't go through this here. This has been pretty well attested. So just have to move on to keep this. Chinese Pidgin English. That's an extinct Chinese pidgin lexified, English lexified pidgin started in Guangzhou, then Hong Kong. There was a Portuguese Creole spoken here in Macau. That's a separate matter, and then spread up the coast. That is now extinct. And then in North America, we have some largely extinct indigenous trade languages, again, among equals. Delaware pidgin, which is now extinct, used among native tribes and also Europeans. There are some Dutch and Swedish lexical items, I believe, in the pidgin. Anthony Boccini has documented that pretty nicely. And that's extinct. It's one of the few cases where the Europeans accommodated indigenous versions of the pidgin rather than the other way around, and that's quite unusual. Down here in the Gulf of Mexico, Mobilian jargon, another Native American pidgin used among indigenous people, linguistically heterogeneous societies for trade. And then the best known one here is Chinook Wawa, or Chinook jargon as it used to be known as, here in the Pacific Northwest. Now pretty much extinct as well. There may be some older rememberers, but those are pidgins. I can give a little sampler here. If you'd like to, I would ask your viewers, I love doing this, your Patreon subscribers who are here today. Can you make any sense of this? This is Tok Pisin. It's an extended pidgin spoken in Papua New Guinea, which has some 670 languages or so, depending on how you count language. And it is now very extended. It's really expanding. A lot of good longitudinal studies about how linguistic expansion takes place.
So Stella submits the second line looks like all cars must stop.
Almost right. Suppose you, okay, walk along road, all cars must stop. Suppose you look red para mark. Okay, so the second part is pretty much correct. She's got that pretty correct.
What is the third one? Suppose you look.
Yes, there it is. Yeah, suppose you look him. Suppose you see red fellow mark. That sign here. This here. Okay.
So walk along the road. All cars.
Actually, it's work along the road.
Oh, work along the road. Work on the road. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Cars must stop. The all here, that is English ALL, so you're she has it correct there. However, this has become a plural marker. All.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Huh.
If this were all cars, it would be olgeta, all together cars must stop. You notice there's no plural marker here. We do get an English modal. That's a bit unusual, but it's an extended pidgin, so why not? But again, here we do see some phonological reduction. Tok Pisin has two and only two prepositions. Belong, from English belong, obviously, for very close association, and long for everything else. My students love it. Just one preposition to learn, no case. Okay, suppose is now if you, whoops. All right, I could do it in this one too here. I was going to go to another one. If you see, that's look, and this I am here is probably from English him. If you look him, if you see, and then this has now become a transitive verb marker. Oops, I'm sorry, geez, I'm sorry, I got a little bit, okay. Quick on the, I've got my mouse is a little sensitive here too. And then, so that has become grammaticalized as a transitive verb marker. And then red para mark, that's fellow. So red fellow mark. And once again, the R has been deleted. And this para here is used on any attributive adjective. So this pidgin, quite unlike some of the other ones here, are, showing some basic morphology coming into view. This here I love. I absolutely love it. This is another example of Tok Pisin for Papua New Guinea, the Mount Hagen market. Law belong nu para market. Okay, so say, well, what? Here's the other preposition, belong. Law belong new market. Para, there's the adjective. Okay, inflection here. So this is the rules of the market. So no can tromoy papia nabout, no throwaway paper about. Okay. No simuk na, oh God, this is great. No simuk na kai kai buai inside long market. You cannot smoke or eat buai. That's a indigenous plant, which is people chew on or smoke and get high. Inside, adverbial, in the market. Okay. What else can we say? No can kai kai inside long market. You may not eat inside the market. All these other rules here too. And then we'll just go down here too in the interest of time. Pay belong brukim long market. 500, and I forget what the unit of kroner or something like crown, something like that. So pay belong breakum law in the market. In other words, penalty for breaking the rules. 50 crowns. So yeah, go ahead, Jackson. Yeah, absolutely.
What I'm seeing here is, and once you reveal some of the kind of spelling conventions and such, it's pretty easy to see that it's lexically based on English. But then, is it common in pidgins that are lexically based on one language to have so many accommodations to what I assume is the phonological structure of another language?
Yes, that would be very, very typical. Pidgins are at their most variable in their phonology. And depending on who's speaking, now this is Tok Pisin being an extended pidgin. There's been a good deal of standardization. You can, there are dictionaries online. There's a couple of really good dictionaries online if you're interested. Also grammars. So there's been a normative tendency, and this is used in the media now as well too. And it has official recognition. I think there's also a radio Tok Pisin that you can listen to. So the spelling is going to be normalized, and there will be nonetheless considerable variation depending on who's using it. If you go to the mountains in Papua New Guinea, this has more. It's not so extended. It's in the rural areas. It's much more restricted, and you get a great deal of variation. I've played audio. If you hear it in the audio, I've got a wonderful recording of Genesis translated. The first chapter of Genesis is translated to Tok Pisin. It's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful translation. When you're using restricted means to, advance basic creation myth constructs, but my students don't understand it at all when they hear it orally. So, and again here, the orthography makes it somewhat more easy to go through. But phonologically, these things are going to be very, very variable. One other thing I just want to mention here too is you can imagine European attitudes toward these languages tend to be very negative, and you can see why from the sort of. It's not hard to find these examples that, well, look at these, the sort of rather racist attitude is, you look at this guy and you think, well, what do you expect? And they're perceived as a, failed attempt to master English. Comes out kind of weird like that. I would argue nothing could be further from the truth. These are, I'll get into that maybe a little later today, these languages turn out the way their creators want them to turn out. It's an exercise in language creation, language construction, not language, not any kind of failure to learn. And I will. All right. So that's basically pidgin. Let's go to Creole. Are we okay here? Are we doing all right here? You can add a little more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll throw in any questions that I see in the chat.
No,
or if I have
absolutely.
something.
Please, any questions? I can't read all the comments just yet, but if there are, please
sure.
feed them to me, and I'll do my best to address them.
I will.
Okay. So anyway, the classical view of what a Creole language is, and this is a very controversial point, and if you've read Sally Mufwene's book, you will know that he would vehemently disagree with this, but at any rate, Creoles are traditionally defined as pidgins that have become the native language or the first language of their speakers. Children acquire that pidgin as their first language. Okay. That view is somewhat hedged by people like John Holm, and he says, quoting him, "It has been commonly assumed that a Creole language has a pidgin in its ancestry." He doesn't say anything about nativization, but somehow in the background there's this, or in the early history, there's this critical event, this moment of contact where, okay, we've got to create something, and people do, and it develops, and if it develops far enough, it becomes a Creole. But again, here, John took out that nativization part. The strongest version of that is of the traditional view is by Talmy Givon. You may know that name, emeritus at the University of Oregon. He defines it as a synthesis de novo by the first generation of native speakers who received a pidgin as their data input and proceeded to create the grammar. Okay, that basically, he's riffing on a very controversial position it would be later articulated by, actually right around this time he started, by Derek Bickerton. I've just submitted an article coming out with Cambridge University Press on Bickerton's controversial views. He takes the strongest view of any linguist or Creolist I'm aware of about children being critical to Creole formation. On the other hand, the late Philip Baker rightly says there is currently no definition of Creole which is acceptable to all the people who study these languages. That's an understatement. Absolutely true. Jackson, you mentioned Sally Mufwene, University of Chicago. He proposes a socio-historical definition of Creole, which I accept. This is probably the least controversial and makes a lot of sense to me. And basically, this is sort of my abstracting from Sally's work. A group of vernaculars that emerged from the 17th through the 19th centuries under similar geographic, demographic, and economic conditions. He says in tropical colonies, I would tweak that to usually tropical colonies, settled by Europeans who typically spoke non-standard varieties of their metropolitan languages. That's a critical point. Totally agree with that. And they put in place plantation economies that used non-indigenous slave labor. Now, there's some things to object to this too, but certainly for European lexified Creoles, this definition makes a lot of sense to me, and I use it as my own working hypothesis. Just one last point here, Jackson, I'll turn it back to you as moderator. The term Creole, it comes from Portuguese, maybe Spanish, but certainly it comes from Romance languages going all the way back to Latin, or words that are cognate with Latin, creare, to make, create, beget, bear. And the term was used in the colonies, probably starting in the Canary Islands, which favors the Spanish origin, but it doesn't matter. It's Iberian. And Creole, first of all, indicated people who were born in the colonies. They could mean white people or people of color. And then later on, they were linked specifically to the African population of enslaved laborers and their descendants. And the word still Richard Alsop's Dictionary of Caribbean English gives this definition: in all its senses connotes New World, especially Caribbean family stock, etc. And this term became generalized by to the languages that these people spoke. So again, originally people born in the islands or in the colonies, let's say, originally could include white people as well as people of color, was semantically narrowed to people of color, enslaved people, and their descendants. Okay, Jackson, those are the basic definitions. If there's anything else you would like me to say about either, let me know. I've got plenty of stuff.
Okay. Well, one thing I thought, it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about maybe some medieval situations or potential medieval situations, but you have done so much work on Afrikaans, and now I'm curious, as a case that we can talk about, is it a Creole? Does it fit your definition
That has
here?
been debated since the 1890s, and not always on scientific grounds, let's say.
Sure. I mean,
So,
looking at Afrikaans as an absolute non-expert, but just looking at it from the outside, as someone who looked at it, it definitely doesn't strike me as being all that incredibly different from Dutch. I'm sure there are those who would disagree with that, but
most assuredly.
But I think that someone who can read Dutch can read, say, a Van Loo or another, Afrikaans writer without extreme accommodation. So to me, I would say that and obviously there's places where the grammar is significantly changed. But I don't know that it seems impressionistically to me to have compromised with another language enough that I would think of it as a Creole. That's just my first impression looking at it from the outside. So I'm curious what you would say about it.
Okay. First of all, I would say Afrikaans is certainly in its written form mutually intelligible with Dutch in its standard written form. There are definitely differences to be overcome, but spoken Afrikaans, vernacular Afrikaans, would be a serious challenge for Dutch people. If I took a Dutch person and dropped that person in Mitchell's Plain, where they speak Kops, this is a rather more creolized variety of Dutch, that person would be very hard. I can guarantee there will be little to no intelligibility. It's the phonology alone is very, very much different.
Interesting.
So I would say, secondly, Afrikaans is like a chimera, the mythological, I assume everybody knows what that is. It's, the body of a lion with a snake and then a goat, coming out of it. It's quite I can find an image if you like, but
I know what you mean.
But you know what I mean? It's a real kludge. And Afrikaans is like that. It really depends on what part of the organism you look at. And if you look at one part of it, it looks kind of Dutch. And if you look at other parts of it, like the negation system, lack of inflection, it does not look Dutch at all. And as far as the mutual intelligibility is concerned, that also depends on who you ask. For about a decade, I had an extraordinary professorship at Stellenbosch University, and I lectured in English. I'm more comfortable in that, but the students could use either Afrikaans or English in their written work or with me, so it was kind of bilingual. And then I showed, I was teaching about the history of Afrikaans, the formation from a Creolistic point of view, and I showed them sort of Dutch-like text from the early 19th century in South Africa, and they said, "Oh my God, we can't read that. That's Dutch. That's just too complicated." Now, admittedly, it was a little bit arch, but that was totally foreign to them. And also, there are now, I believe, Dutch Afrikaans dictionaries. There are comparative grammars of the two, which is perfectly fine. On the other hand, another colleague of mine proposed to sort of link Afrikaans to Dutch in a sort of pluricentric relationship, which I thought completely unrealistic, but he seemed to think that this was doable, that really we should just consider Afrikaans an extraterritorial variety of Dutch. Different for sure, but I thought that a rather strange proposal, but fair enough. So what I can do, if I can take you on a little cook's tour of Afrikaans history, if that would be useful to you or
Sure, sounds
interesting.
to me. And
I hope this is interesting to the good people who are.
oh, we're all language nerds.
All right, okay, we're good. Then we can nerd this out big time.
So, well, what's interesting to me too, and what you've just said, is that I've been misled then and not perceiving the full spectrum of what's called Afrikaans, because I'm looking at fairly, probably more Dutch oriented writing.
Perfectly understandable. That's what most people would. That's how I started with it too.
Yeah, interesting. So there's actually a lot more going on under the umbrella of Afrikaans.
Absolutely. I have a little presentation if you'd like to see it.
Sure.
It may take.
Yeah,
Okay, let's give it a shot.
And in the meantime, by the way, Magdalena asked how frequently pidgins and Creoles are created. Maybe, I mean, of course, it's going to depend on what you call a Creole, but are there situations today where there's active creation? I mean, not just at an individual level. I go to Japan and I try to communicate, but are there places in the world where this is happening as much now? I feel like it wouldn't be happening as much now because there's so much access to the international trade language of English.
Right. No, that's a huge difference for sure. Most pidgins, when they form, and pidgins, I think have to go back right to the beginnings of human language, and I've written on that myself as well. That pidgins might. I feel less confident in that now than I did 10 years ago, but be that as it may. Wherever you had language contact, you have the possibility for pidgins. I always had to, the story of Babel in Genesis, and that, the diversification of the tongues. I always thought that would have ended differently, that you'd get a pidgin right off the bat because these people would still keep working, as long as they wanted to. But most pidgins are ephemeral. They have their span and then they die out. And Jackson, we linguists can have some pretty lame humor, and the humor is nobody mourns a dead pigeon. Ha ha. So yeah, I know. And Creoles would be exceptional in the sense of, if you take Sally Mufweni's definition, enslaved or indentured agriculture in plantation situations, I don't think you're going to see that anymore. Since that's a big part of it, because you have non-indigenous people imported against their will en masse to other venues. So you might get, pidgin situations out of something, out of migration, but more often than not, people are going to start, for the very reasons you give, to learn some other existing language. That's the easier route. Pidgin's the hard way. And if we get into the earliest stages of the pidgins, the jargon phase, those are almost always, ephemeral. And you either get language shift or there's no need for communication. And so that'll be the end of it. Now, just let me add one more point, that if you expand Sally's definition of of Creole, you might see some Creole formation in Africa with this Juba Arabic and others. Some would consider that on the cusp of Creolization, which would mean, back to the old definition, these varieties are getting first language speakers. On the other hand, if you look at Tok Pisin, extended pidgin, some people are learning it as their first language. Others use it purely as an auxiliary language. And we could say maybe it's on the cusp of Creolization, but it may expand and expand. And again, we've got good longitudinal research on its expansion, but probably won't go the whole way. And I will have that in my next little presentation.
Okay.
What I mean by the whole.
And it has me thinking about, well, kind of a pseudo statistical thought experiment. If we've had pretty consistent written records somewhere in the world for about 4,000 years, and if for about 300, 200 of those years, we have this period in the 1600s to about 1800 where Creoles were forming. So if there's an event where we have a lot of Creole formation about once in 4,000 years, then in the history of human languages, you could have had several periods where some social circumstances lead to the formation of Creoles several times in the history of human language. This would really scramble our understanding of languages family trees, going back beyond about 4,000 years. And I wonder how much that affects our inability to reconstruct a proto-world, because at some point in the history of Proto-Indo-European, it's coming from something that's Creolized, or in the history of Creole, it's Creolized.
I would stop somewhat short of creolization, but definitely language contact for sure in that way. The whole idea of language mixing to this degree really undermines the idea of the Stammbaum, or the family tree, which does not do convergence very well at all. No. It's divergent. This debate broke out at numerous times. If you go back to the 19th, early 20th century, you may know the name Hugo Schuchart, who was a Creolist, mainly at Graz in Austria, who basically told the Neo-Grammarians, look, guys, you got this wrong. You're not taking language contact into account at all. You're basically excluding this. But that's the norm. And he didn't make a very good distinction between pidgins and Creoles. He called just about everything Creoles, but that really doesn't really matter for this purpose here. And said that, this just invalidates the notion. This is the norm, this kind of language contact. And you can't there's just certain things you can't reconstruct using the normal comparative method and come out right with. And they resisted that and said, well, again, typical Eurocentric, you could even say racist attitudes. Well, those languages don't count. That doesn't count. They're corruptions, bastardizations. And Schuchart was kind of a lone voice at the time here. And then you go into the 20s, Antoine Meillet raised this subject again, try to accommodate this. Fast forward now to Salim Mufwene, who says that Creole languages are consistent with the family tree model, that they're disfranchised dialects of their lexifier languages. So Mauritian Creole French is a dialect of French. It's very distant, but so what? Go down to Gascony, it's going to be different. What's the big difference? Shows a lot more language contact, but no big deal. That is also a very, very warmly disputed question. And that gets us into the Creole exceptionalist argument. And that's become very, very politicized as well, too. And I'll send you the paper I wrote, if you like, Jackson, if you're interested on this whole thing.
And if you don't mind, I'll share it with interested patrons as well.
Okay, if you could, I'm sorry, if you could just hold off on that until we have a firm publication date.
Oh, sure. Okay, yeah.
Because it's
I don't realize it was not published. Yeah, okay.
No, it's in draft. I've sent it out to some people for criticism, but it's going to come out. I just have not received the second reader's report on it yet. So, so I'd rather not put it out publicly at this time. But
sure. Yeah, I didn't mean.
But I will make it once that's cleared. Then definitely, no problem at all.
Could you? So, if we could talk about your Afrikaans presentation, that'd be interesting. And then, naturally, some questions have arisen about the Old Norse, Old English situation.
Sure.
Need to get into it, but it probably be neat to look at Afrikaans as a case study first.
Okay, here we go. Okay.
because like, what was it, 9 years ago, there was someone at, I think, the University of Oslo who was really, really flogging the Middle English as a Creole hypothesis, which
Yeah, that breaks out like the flu from time to time. So anyway, here we go in
yeah, it does.
Afrikaans. I just start here. One of our most famous speakers of Afrikaans here in North America is Trevor Noah, host of The Daily Show. It's one of the languages that he speaks. And again, here, there's a really nice article. Oh, by the way, Jackson, I would be very happy to make either of these decks available if that would be useful to you or if any of your Patreon people. So move on here. Afrikaans, obviously spoken primarily in the Republic of South Africa, also in Namibia, and as a second, third, fourth, or fifth language in the other borderline states. May interest you to know that my colleague Andries Kutsia at the University of Michigan, my alma mater, has been doing work with a vestigial Afrikaans speaking community in Patagonia in Argentina, where during the early 20th century, a group of Afrikaans people emigrated there to get away from what they considered British hegemony. So, but that's a Sprachinsel, that's a language island that will basically die out when the oldest speakers die out. Okay, we start here with Dutch colonialism. The Dutch East India Company, probably the world's first multinational corporation. Just imagine Microsoft with a military wing. Established a colony in Batavia, what they called Batavia, modern day Jakarta, and of course eventually took over most of the Indonesian archipelago. They called it the Dutch East Indies. As you can see, here's Amsterdam, here's Batavia. Think of the early 17th century on Windjammer. That was one long, dangerous trip. People got sick. Sailors needed refreshment. And Cape Town, what is today Cape Town, where is it right here, was a very frequent halfway stop, roughly halfway, close enough. And they would, stop, get water, trade with the locals for cattle, meat, things, or for meat, actually, things like that, and be on their way. 1652 is when the Dutch East India Company decided, hey, this place is pretty useful for us as a halfway point. It would be a very cool idea and possibly very lucrative financially to establish a refreshment station here for ships plying the trade between Europe and the so-called Orient, and Asia. And so here's the background: beautiful Table Mountain, Table Bay, and they decided that's what they would do. Okay, so the history of Afrikaans basically starts there. And with this formation of a Dutch outpost, they didn't intend originally to colonize the whole area. They thought if they could just keep it here, trade with the indigenous Khoikhoi people, that would suffice. But of course, that's not how the history worked out at all. There were three basic periods: the Dutch East India Company period, which goes to the Napoleonic Wars in 1795. The British took over, kind of gave it back, and then took it over permanently, and then added it to their inventory of colonies. And then they controlled Southern Africa until the Union of South Africa in 1910. So this is the time span for the history of Afrikaans. Okay. I started out in my own research by trying to establish what the linguistic ecology might have been prior to 1652. And just in brief, without going into detail, we would assume a chain of languages or dialects spoken by the Khoikhoi, literally the people of people, whom the Dutch called the Hottentots, or all the Europeans called them the Hottentots. That's a racially charged term, so be forewarned. Plus another group of nomadic people called the San, or the Bushmen. That term still seems to be okay. And then, of course, here in the interior, speakers of Bantu languages of various and sundry kinds. The Bantu languages themselves, of course, just here, is also brought to Southern Africa by migration. And they bumped up against the Khoikhoi right around these parts here. And click languages, the Nguni group of a Bantu language that's primarily Zulu and Xhosa. These clicks were it's probably a Sprachbund or an aerial phenomenon that originated with the Khoikhoi and the Bushmen. But these Bantu languages were not really important for the formation of Afrikaans. Okay, moving along. Between 1590-ish and 1652, Europeans and Khoikhoi had regular contact, again, with ships coming around the Cape, stopping there, hanging out, getting fresh water, fresh meat, trying to recover, and then moving on. Same thing on the return to Europe. And then finally, in 1652, this station was established. And the Khoikhoi, who were used to seeing these Europeans just come and go, realized very quickly the game is going to change and be rigged from there on to their disadvantage. They were the primary substrate community when the Europeans settled permanently, and they are going to be very influential in the earliest stages of what we today call Afrikaans. Okay, so at any rate, this outpost under the command of Jan van Riebeck, the Europeans, the Dutch East India Company built a fort they started it during his commandership. You can go there today. The fort, or let's say the next iteration, it's been rebuilt twice since then, is very visitable and very interesting today in Cape Town. Downtown is just to the right here. Let's move on here too. This created what we in Creolistics call a fort situation that really disrupted that indigenous economy. That's when Europeans establish permanent bases. So this is one big difference right away with the sort of traditional plantation situation. Developing relationships with the indigenous people, sometimes intermarrying, although that did not happen very often here. But nonetheless, sort of classic fort situation in Nuche. And again here with this castle or fortress. That changed yet again just 6 years after the permanent settlement with the introduction of slave labor. The labor needs were critical. The Dutch did not have enough of their own company personnel to do it. They talked about enslaving the indigenous Khoikhoi. That was resisted by corporate headquarters in Amsterdam. They said, no, no, no. If you want slaves, you can bring them in from elsewhere, but don't enslave the indigenous Khoikhoi. Overall, an estimated 63,000 enslaved persons were imported to the Cape Colony between 1652 and 1808. That's a minuscule number compared to European colonies in North America, but consider the outpost and free population were also minuscule compared to European colonies in the Americas. Cape Colony became a Creole community with the importation of non-indigenous enslaved labor. However, they worked alongside indentured indigenous labor. Okay, so the Khoikhoi were not enslaved; they were enserfed, and they, worked as wage laborers. A very exploitative system, but legally, they were free. They could not be bought and sold. I'm going to get back to these 2 points later. I just want to move on. By the end of the Dutch East India Company period in 1795, the European population about 15,000, the slave population slightly greater, just under 17,000, and then maybe the Khoikhoi were wiped out in large numbers by European diseases. 2 horrible smallpox epidemics reduced their numbers, probably from about 100,000 to about 15,000. But at any rate, you've got 3 groups here of roughly equal population, of roughly equal demographics in this geographic area here. That's the limit of European expansion by 1795, who are going to be instrumental in creating what we know today as Afrikaans. If you want, I thought of you, Jackson, when your Georgia connection. That colony circa 1695 would be about comparable to the state of Georgia and maybe the southern counties of South Carolina. So that'll give you an idea of how big it was. Okay. All right. We learned later, after 1795, that the slave population was actually rather larger. Now, there's this big bump. You know, the Dutch East India Company did a census every so many years. The British did another one, and then we go from 16,839 to 25,764. How on earth did that happen? Well, the importation of enslaved labor was constant. Locally born slaves were lower in number and not enough to carry the workload. But also, there was a lot of trading off the books by these Dutch East India Company officials. That was, the Dutch East India Company tolerated it if it wasn't too obvious, but a sure way to catch the attention of headquarters that you were doing trading off the books was large numbers of slaves. So no doubt the Dutch officials were not totally upfront and you know, put their numbers down from what they really were. This is what Cape Town looks like today from the air. Downtown is here. I'm sorry, right around here. The castle's right around here. Phenomenally beautiful city. It's one of the most beautiful cities I've ever visited. I absolutely love the place. This is the famous Table Mountain. Laying the tablecloth, this cloud cover comes and, you know, covers this. It's really cool to watch. And it's sort of give you an idea. Okay, Jackson mentioned the controversy here. Is Afrikaans just an extraterritorial variety of Dutch that happens to be recognized as an independent language and just happens, like English, to show a lot of language contact? Is it a Creole? Is it a semi-Creole? Is it a Creoloid? Is it some other kind of contact language? This has been long debated. Okay, so these would be the principal influences from Khoikhoi dialects, Malay, and Creole Portuguese. These two brought in by the slave population as their, I mean, a lot of different languages, but these were the two most important ones. The mainstream view, the establishment view from Fritz Ponelis, Afrikaans is historically a deviant Dutch dialect. Okay. In the multilingual setting at the Cape, Dutch was subjected to linguistic interference. I do not like this idea at all. In other words, rapid and drastic linguistic change due to the imperfect learning of Dutch by a number of foreign speakers. Note the Eurocentrism here, foreign speakers. Okay, Khoikhoi would not in any sense be considered foreign. You know, and not only that, but certainly this is factually correct. There were French speakers, Huguenots who came down. There were Low Germans, High Germans, other Europeans too. So this is the mainstream view. So it has been for quite some time. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And notice here, the apple valt niet ver van die boom af nie. This negator here and this double negator here, this supplemental one, that is Afrikaans, not Dutch. That's one of the major differences here. People have tried to relate that to Dutch. I have shown otherwise. And D here instead of duh, you know, gender is gone in the noun, you know, duh and het are both gone. So D, which is a demonstrative pronoun, is taken over as the normal definite article. That's very, very Creole to use a demonstrative as a normal definite article. Okay, so here are sort of my theses here. First theses, go back to the pidgins, folks, to think about that. Jargonized forms of Dutch and English were used among the Khoikhoi because of these transient European visitors. Everybody used morphologically reduced forms of their language. So you drop the endings, drop the gender, drop the case, drop the tenses, use roots. Everybody made compromises until they could communicate. Again, the aim was communication. Nobody was interested in learning the other's language. Europeans often made use of local interpreters. The Dutch, who were so famous for their linguistic range, learning other languages, small country, big trade network, they generally, with few exceptions, did not learn Khoi languages, which were considered very, with clicks and tones, very, very difficult to acquire. My late colleague and dear friend Hunston Beston, you may know that name, Jackson, has collected a lot of the source material, and he posited a Cape Dutch pidgin, but he did not systematically distinguish between these ephemeral jargonized and pidginized forms of Dutch. Pidginized forms, I would say these are forms that have acquired social standing. They became entrenched. The jargonized forms may or may not. They may have been one-off, ephemeral, and not taken into the language. He assumes there are 3 different pidgins. I disagree with that totally, but we'll move on here too. So my second thesis is whenever 2, or better yet 3 or more groups of people lacking a common language and enter into sudden and sustained contact and have a mutual interest in intercommunication and the maintenance of their group identity, they are likely to start constructing a basic medium for interethnic communication. This is from Philip Baker. This is the constructive view of pidginization, which I have adopted and expanded. Thirdly, there was a nearly autonomous slave community that resided in or passed through Cape Town. Cape Town was really the only port in that part of the world, and everything went through Cape Town, including the slave trade. Once slaves started arriving, they worked alongside of Khoikhoi, as well as Europeans. They learned the Khoikhoi trade jargon and made it their medium of interethnic communication, albeit with modifications, their own additions, and that became the lingua franca of what I call the labor caste. That is to say, enslaved and indigenous labor, speaking very different languages. They had to communicate with one another as part of the workforce. I call that the Cape Dutch pidgin, one Cape Dutch pidgin, which could vary depending on who is speaking it, but nonetheless just one. So let's see, okay. Now, so far in terms of creolization, getting back to Jackson's question. So if we take Mufwene's definition, we get a check here. Creoles emerge from the 17th through the 17th centuries. That's true for Afrikaans. Under similar geographic, demographic, and economic conditions, well, somewhat, we'll consider that in a moment. In usually tropical colonies, well, it's not tropical, it's a Mediterranean climate down around the Cape, but settled by Europeans who spoke non-standard varieties of, in our case, Dutch, and that's most certainly true. Holland was the founder dialect, maybe even South Holland, that's a debate. And then put into place economies that utilize non-indigenous slave labor. Well, we get a check in that box for Cape Colony, but maybe here because non-indigenous labor played a major role as well. Okay, here again, this flows from Jackson's question. At the Cape, slave labor generally followed that of European colonies and in the Americas and other parts of the world, but there are some big differences. First of all, unlike the Caribbean and North American and South American colonies, the Dutch East India Company's orbit or area of operation was primarily in the Indian Ocean, not in Western Africa. And Cape Town was a hypermarket, a very strategic port, serving not only Dutch crews, but crews from all the Portuguese, French, English, anyone who wanted to put in there and pay to have their ships serviced. When whites settled here, typically there was some ongoing immigration from the Netherlands, but a lot of Dutch East India Company ordinary personnel taking their discharges here, figuring, I'm not going to make it in Europe. This is a pretty cool place. Maybe I can get some land. And they didn't want to do, manual labor. They wanted to farm and they wanted to land. So there was a free Black population, but not enough to meet the labor needs. So importation of slave labor for these 2 reasons was ongoing. Okay, the slave labor force in the Cape Colony here was arguably the most diverse of any known slave population. They came from all over the Indian Ocean, Goa, Malabar, Bengal, parts of India, Ceylon, Sri Lanka today, all over Indonesia, Madagascar, Mozambique, and then the Mascarenes. These are these islands here in the Indian Ocean, and they're not shown, but they took slaves. They were expensive. They were prized. They got them for the East India Company wherever they could get them. Okay, another big difference between the Caribbean Creoles, the sort of canonical Creoles, and Afrikaans. What we call event 2 did not happen. Event 1 is when the slave and the European population are in equipoise. They're roughly the same. Event 2 is when the locally born slave population, this is locally born, reaches numerical parity with the slave owning population. This didn't happen in the Cape Colony. Okay, and that's linguistically highly significant. So the slave population is slightly greater than the European, but the locally born population was not. So that means more pidgin, less Creole, okay, when you get new slaves coming in. Another big difference, most of the slaves were male, very low birth rate, okay? The slave population did increase naturally. Those who were born to a slave mother were enslaved themselves legally, but again, the need for more imported labor, less locally born. Now, gradually the gender balance, improved, but again here, still to only 30%. Okay, another difference here is that we have a labor caste, okay, in the typical understanding of the term. This is what you were born into. The Khoikhoi, the so-called Hottentots, were increasingly impressed into the labor force, first as wage laborers, then under contracts. In other words, you do a day's work, get a day's pay, then under contracts, and then basically under an apprenticeship, which was tantamount to slavery as well. And again, that undermined their economy. They became increasingly dependent on the Europeans. We know that they worked alongside the slaves and had to communicate with them, because we find all kinds of accounts here. For example, a wealthy farmer who says, yep, I got my slaves, I got my pots, that's his term, working together. Many examples like that, so we know that happened. Big difference number 5, no large slave holdings except for the Dutch East India Company itself, and maybe a few of the bigger wine and grain estates in just outside of Cape Town. Most slaves that were not held by the Dutch East India Company were in very small distributions, 10 or fewer. Some of the biggest estates may have had 50, holdings over 100, very, very rare. Out on the frontier, out in this part here, where you had these European migrant farmers, typically wage labor provided by Khoikhoi, maybe a slave or two, but not very many. Compare that with sugar monoculture in the Caribbean, where you had, which is a very labor intensive enterprise, where much, much, much larger slave holdings than in the United States. Difference number 6, slavery in South Africa, or let's say in the Cape Colony, was for the most part an urban phenomenon. That is radically different from other Creole communities, okay? So most of the slaves, virtually all of them who came in through Cape Town. The Dutch East India Company, and this was the extent of the city, right around 1795, town really. They were housed in what was called the Slave Lodge, which was built in 1679. Initially built to house 300 residents, enslaved people, speaking all kinds of different languages, pidginizing Dutch in this very area here. And it was rebuilt several times to hold more. It also served as an insane asylum for the mentally ill, and also as a jail. So this is what it, sort of model of what it looked like. It had at its peak a capacity of 1,000 enslaved individuals, on average anywhere somewhere between 475 and 600 slaves, male and female, amongst others, political exiles, the mentally ill. A few were sent out to other parts of the Dutch East India Company operation, but most of them were housed here. And that is important, big difference here. So that's the big slave holding. Okay, Now, my view here, again here, going back to pidgins and Creoles, we're almost done. All pidgins and Creoles are or were formerly mediums of interethnic communications. Many fundamental mediums of interethnic communication, basically pidgins, subsequently became expanded or elaborated. They got more structure, more words. And many of these became mediums of community solidarity. This is Philip Baker's model. Medium of community solidarity is a form of speech that is closely related to the medium of interethnic communication, but sufficiently different from the latter to serve as a badge of identity for locally born slaves, enabling them to recognize each other as such on the basis of speech alone. This is where you get a Creole community or Creole culture. This is what happened in most of the European colonies that show Creole languages elsewhere in the world. This did not happen in the Cape of Good Hope. This was a very big difference. What happened? Well, right, what happened, you asked? All right, because of the urban character and the way Cape labor was organized, we get instead an extended or elaborated Cape Dutch pidgin. So this pidgin grows. It served not as a medium of community solidarity, but what I call a medium of subaltern alliance, or we could call it a medium of subaltern identity. It was emblematic of the labor caste in the Cape Colony: indigenous indentured workers, non-indigenous enslaved workers, locally born enslaved workers. Okay. Members of the patron class, the ownership class, the European class, knew it or knew some of it or enough of it. Maybe not, it's not theirs, except maybe among the lowest rung, and I'll get to that in a minute. And so what that gave rise to is an intertwining of the extraterritorial variety of Dutch, Euro-Cape Dutch spoken by the whites, and this medium of subaltern alliance, the Cape Dutch pidgin. This is a highly unusual situation. And this is why you get the chimera effect, Jackson, of why sometimes Afrikaans looks so Dutch, but other times it's got all these other very non-Dutch elements in it. So this is very different from the Creole organization of structure that we see elsewhere. This is in schematic form. This is a pretty busy slide, just sort of schematically, says what I, summarize what I just said. Go from these jargonized forms from the beginning, becoming a stable pidgin with the addition of the slave community to the Khoikhoi workforce. It gets extended, okay? And then it takes the identity of this subaltern alliance. Now, keep in mind that the Khoikhoi were free people. They did not want to be identified as slaves. The slaves, for their part, rarely learned Khoi languages. I've only recorded or documented one or two cases. Maybe there were more, perhaps they were, but they were going to be using this pidgin as well. It's the pidgin of the workforce. Now, at the interface, we get the intertwining. The interface between this extended pidgin and Euro-Cape Dutch, you've got what I call the Cape Dutch vernacular. I don't call it Afrikaans, and you'll see why in a minute, spoken by the colored population, that's how that translates, and by very simple whites. Okay, this is a Dutch guy writing about, well, there are some white people who live amongst these who are learning this or know this as well. So what is Afrikaans then? Afrikaans is an autonym chosen by Euro-Cape Dutch language entrepreneurs. And what we know today is Afrikaans is a very focused, standardized variety that came out of this. And it began to take shape in the last quarter of the 19th century. One force driving this was Afrikaner nationalism. Group of Cape Dutch speaking people, whites, wanted political empowerment. They were afraid of being anglicized. They took the view, look, white people are going to run this place. So it's either going to be the British, but why not us? And so to politicize their fellow white people, they kind of hijacked this Cape Dutch vernacular, or part of it. One force was called the Society of True Afrikaners, that is in the town of Paarl, which is near Stellenbosch, which is near Cape Town. they started writing down this vernacular, devising norms for writing, and they gave it the label Afrikaans. If you'd ask a white Dutch-speaking person back then, well, what do you speak? Well, I speak Dutch. I mean, it's our Dutch. It's not European Dutch, but it's ours. It's Dutch. They said, no, let's give it a name. Naming rights are really politically important in languages standardization. And what they did for their written norms was they took, the Cape Dutch vernacular. They wanted something that sounded kind of African to separate themselves from the Dutch linguistically, but they did draw on European Dutch for certain norms. If we needed certain words, we'll go to Dutch. So they use Dutch as a source language to augment it. This is another group, the South African Academy of Science and Art. Sure, you must be struck by the demographic here, all white guys. They wanted to promote, unlike an academy elsewhere, they did this very cleverly. They said, let's, for the promotion of Dutch. But what they understood by Dutch was not just Dutch, but by this emerging standardized varieties called Afrikaans. So it's a bit of a subterfuge there. It's still extant today, but it's a very unusual kind of thing. So again, others in the political empowerment of white, now Afrikaans speaking people, they play the religion card. Where Christian nationalists, they played the language card. We speak our own language. We have our separate identity. We're not English, we're not Dutch, we're Afrikaans. Here is a scene from a movie called Doet Kruisman, which is good Afrikaans for, English would say, can't keep us down, but that doesn't really quite get it. And of course, here's this poor little boy, this is total propaganda, who spoke Afrikaans in classroom, who's being made to stand in the corner with this label here, with not an uncommon trope. The National Party took power in 1948, and this is the cabinet here. Prime Minister D.F. Malang here. Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, is here. All white, all Afrikaans speaking, and I love this here. Like, yeah, man, we did it. This election was pivotal, and so apartheid begins in earnest here. Afrikaans has a language monument. Did you know that, Jackson?
I did not.
Okay, here's a fun fact. Afrikaans has a language monument. This is also in Paarl, and was built in 1975 on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Society for True Afrikaners. If you may permit me a bit of a crudity, when you drive in, you see this here, this pole here, this is Dutch. And then on this angle here, there's a decline because it's sort of low Dutch, French, German, and here's Dutch here. So it starts here, 1652, this descent. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go back. I don't want to go quite there yet. Mixing with German, mixing with French, and then this curve of development, of elaboration, of writing. And this is the brilliant, wonderful future of Afrikaans. This is English here. You'll notice that's being eclipsed. This here is Malay. You'll notice here is separate from all the others. And then these sort of bumps here are indigenous language as well, too, also conveniently separate. If you drive into Paarl, it looks like, and I've done this many times, it looks like the middle finger being sent up to the rest of Africa. It's really quite surprising. The Stellenbosch students call it the taalpaal, the language pole, which pole being another term for penis. And it is sort of phallic here too. I was blown away. This is just another fun fact. This ad here, this has nothing to do with South Africa here in the States, for their ad, took the background with the Paarl Mountain here and then this part of the language monument. I think that's just so funny. Well, I don't think they had a clue what this was about. A year later, 1976, the Soweto uprising. And again here, against the use, this was the last straw, an ill-advised attempt to get teachers to teach primary subjects to African children in Afrikaans rather than in English or in their native languages, their first languages. Profoundly misguided effort. So just to conclude here, the whole origin question of Afrikaans. And again, back to your question, Jackson. John Holm, my late colleague, said the original question goes right to the heart of the identity of the language and its speakers and relates to how they might fit into the larger society. Here's the language monument. At the Cape, however, there are people who are promoting the local vernacular called kops, and they go so far as to even rename either Afrikaans or at least their variety as Afrikaans. They resist the name Afrikaans. That was imposed. Africapes, African Cape. This is a much more creolized variety of Afrikaans, very radically different than the standard language, and also with the, to say nothing of Dutch. This is very politicized. Afrikaans, as spoken by whites, has a very negative attitude. There have been many attempts to extirpate it from as a medium of instruction at universities. You'll see here, to hell with Afrikaans, Afrikaans must fall. And there's quite a backlash here too among usually white Afrikaans speakers. Praat Afrikaans or hou je bek. Speak Afrikaans or shut your face. Afrikaans will remain. Again here, so this has become has been a very volatile political issue. There is a whole revisionist history of Afrikaans among cultural studies people in South Africa, scholars of color. Hein Willemse, who's the rector now of the University of Pretoria. Afrikaans also has a black history rather than just the known hegemonic apartheid history inculcated by white Afrikaner Christian national education. Afrikaans is the Creole language that evolved during the 19th century under colonialism of Southern Africa, and on and on. This guy here, Hemelbesham, Heaven Broom, hip hop artist, again here as come out with a treatise. More than an oppressor's language, he too is trying to reclaim the hidden history of Afrikaans. I have no issue with any of this, but these are not linguists. So these are political endeavors. And what I've tried to do is given some linguistic, supports, just like Jackson, you've been doing all along in your efforts to try to get good information out on the history of Afrikaans. Last point, present day Afrikaans is the outcome of a great deal of deliberate standardizing and planning, and not a natural language in the sense of not interfered with. And that's one reason why it in the standard variety looks a lot more like Dutch. You go to these other communities, people of color, the Cape Islam, Cape Muslims, it's a mosque in Cape Town, or other so-called colored, I know that sounds rather jaded here, but that's a term that's often used. Mirrors, it's kind of rather crudism. I'm reluctant to translate, but let's just say a damn good welcome on my customers. Note here, a lot of code switching goes on as well here too. So there is a whole story that needs to be, definitely needs to be told. And for what it's worth, have been working in that direction. Thank you I hope that wasn't too over the top, but.
No, very interesting. That's more than I ever knew about the history of Afrikaans. And of course, part of what I'm getting from this whole conversation is, what you call a Creole and what you put into that category depends so much on the definition that you want to use of it. And it's, you can talk about maybe, I'm trying to think of what a more neutral term is, maybe mixed language, right?
I would actually resist that. That has a technical definition as well.
Okay.
It's called bilingual mixed language, and that would be languages like media lengua in Ecuador, where you have two languages that intertwine. Actually, Afrikaans, if I'm correct on this, sort of looks like a mixed language. So actually for Afrikaans, I would not oppose that at all.
Okay.
Come to think of it. But that's when you have two languages, one of which, depending on the language, provides the lexicon, the other provides the grammar.
Okay.
So it's Spanish Lexis with Quechua morphosyntax, Michif spoken Manitoba, dying language, French and Cree, but with the noun system, I think is Cree, the verb system is French, or it may switch around. I have to look that up. I've forgotten, but.
Okay. But I mean, having, I have to go in 25 minutes here. So I just wanted to.
I'm sorry if I took too much time.
No. But I wanted to kind of bring some of the basic concepts that we've talked about here and bring them to a question that was brought up by Matt Barclay about, this question that comes up about English as potentially, quote, Creolized, with reference to Old Norse and Old English. I think that, if anything, what you've shown me is that beyond the fact that I don't think English is grammatically mixed enough, the social situation that produced Middle English is nothing like the social situation that canonically produces a Creole language.
I totally agree with that. Totally.
So, what do you think about this question? How does English, would you categorize it as anything like Creole or a mixed language? What is your?
No, I would definitely, especially under the definition that Salim Mufwene gives, I would absolutely, the social conditions were totally different. I would call it Koineization is probably the term I would use.
Koine.
A Koine, given, and I would look more to the Norse settlement rather than the Norman invasion. Going way back, Charles James and Bailey he was kind of out there. Wicked smart guy, but with some really wild ideas. Says that English is a romance-based Creole. And this was back in the late 70s. No, this goes back quite a ways. Which, no. Norman French was the province of the elite, not on the grassroots. Whereas the Norman invasion and settlement, not only you have a plethora of place names and loanwords, but you get deep. I mean, when you get pronouns that are from Old Norse and not Old English, that's pretty deep into the grammar. Mm-hmm. But because these, varieties are they're genetically related, not typologically that different, I could see how, deflection could take place. There's an article by Wayne O'Neill, formerly of MIT, he's deceased, who tried to sort that out for, certainly for Afrikaans. He did not take the Creole view, but that really wasn't his agenda. But also for English, to show that how inflections, which are very low in information content and often difficult to perceive, and therefore are expendable, and people will go to roots rather than, or maybe just one inflected or finite form and use that for everything rather than acquire paradigms. I think that's the most likely scenario for English, which would not be a Creole at all. Who was it? Young Tarja Farland, and who's
I think that's right.
And Fritz. Oh gosh. Oh, sorry, my memory's blanking here. They put out a monograph, right?
I think it's right.
Is this what you're thinking of? And they tried to,
or something.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And they're claiming that English is actually a North Germanic language now.
Yeah, I don't buy it.
I don't. That's a very, very radical view for sure.
I mean, Koine, that's an interesting term that you use, and for those who might not be familiar with it, of course, the term is originally used for the Greek of the New Testament, which is largely based on Attic or Athenian Greek, but also meant to sort of compromise with speakers of other dialects. It's not the broadest Athenian. I could see Middle English having aspects of a Koine, especially considering just how much the dialects of Old English differ from one another.
For sure.
So there are compromises increasingly made through the Middle English period between dialects. But also Old Norse is a close enough language. We're not talking about Dutch and Malay, right? Exactly. Or Dutch and Khoikhoi. We're talking about two languages where there was still some mutual intelligibility. So I think Koine is I think you're right that that's a much better term for it. Yeah,
that would be my view. But the Creole hypothesis does come up again and again and again, and I'm sure it'll come up again too. But I try to take as many very restrictive definitions of pidgins and Creole. So And ultimately, going back to an earlier point you made, the natural tendency is to sort of slice up and typologize different varieties of language, and that ultimately gets to be kind of arbitrary anyway.
Mhm.
So to my mind, whether you want to call Afrikaans a Creole or a semi-Creole, I mean, I would say a Creole community, definitely, but typologically, that's really not, to my mind, that's not I mean, it's convenient labeled. We'll call it a semi-Creole, I'm fine with that, but
Well, and I think the term is even harder to apply to any stage in the history of English.
definitely.
Although,
Oh, I meant for Afrikaans, not for English, excuse me.
yeah, although at the same time, it raises interesting questions to me, like I said earlier, about what might have been happening in prehistory, right? I think
Oh, glad you brought that up, yes.
it just makes it so much harder to reconstruct these really deep family trees when you know that at some point, again, maybe every 4,000 years there's a significant mixing event, but even every 4,000 years means that beyond 4,000, 5,000 years, it gets really hard to reconstruct family trees. Um, I've recently learned a fair amount of Finnish, which is of course Uralic rather than Indo-European, but you can see structural similarities between Finnish and Indo-European, especially in the verb.
Sure.
And I look at that and I say, there's got to be some deeper connection there. But maybe one reason why it's hard to reconstruct is that there's been a mixing event in one or both families that's made it really hard to recover what the linguistically genetic ancestor is of that language.
For sure. And there has been very significant contact between Germanic and Finnish, for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a
You're
ton of
going way
actually,
back, going way, way back too.
yeah, I mean, to the point where many of the basic function words of Finnish are, well, effectively frozen Proto-Germanic or even pre-Germanic words, uh, which is itself an interesting question. What exactly was the language context situation between speakers of Proto-Finnic and Proto-Germanic?
I
It's
have
it's a whole
on
other
a
world.
absolutely this prehistoric problem that you lay out is something I've been busy with over the last 10 years for Proto-Germanic. And on a dare from Joe Salmons, I gave
It's a heck of a person to dare you to do anything, but okay. One of my
Joe and I
heroes.
we go back many years. But it was an encouraging dare, and I think our whole understanding of Proto-Germanic, of the traditional understanding, is wrong, because I've been working on the weak verb system, and I gave this paper at Provo, Utah, and I'll be giving the conclusion. I'm going to submit that for the next GLAC, which will be in Banff, as I recall. And so you get these dead ends. I mean, if you're familiar, Jackson, you're familiar with the weak verb system, of course, in Germanic. They reconstruct like for the third week class. I mean, you look at that cross-linguistically, and it's so totally different in the various dialects. And far better minds than mine have attempted to solve this and really have not done it at all. Why you get a completely different third week class in Old High German with that long E, as opposed to Gothic, which is totally different, as opposed to Old Norse, which merges that third week class with the other classes. The fourth week class is gone altogether. And in Ingvaeonic, you've got almost nothing left of it. I mean, and trying to reconstruct a paradigm on that is impossible.
Mhm.
So where did it come from? And I have a contact explanation for that, which I'll won't bore you with that right now. But what I'm saying is that you're asking a question that means a lot to me and is very interesting. And I think others have tried this too. Theophenomon is, you may be familiar with that name, tried to come up with contact between Vasconian, of which Basque is the last remnant, as a substrate, and for when the Indo-Europeans came in, and then what he calls Semitic, Semitic, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic related or previous dialects coming up the littoral up through Ireland, and he claims that's where you get the VSO order and Insular Celtic. So there've been some pretty radical hypotheses that have been proposed, and one may or may not agree with that. But I appreciated his attempt to do that, to reopen these questions. So I think there's a lot that can be done using cases like Afrikaans or Creoles as a kind of laboratory, even though I wouldn't expect to find, social conditions attended to Creolization, but nonetheless,
But
I would
contact.
go back to Schuchart and say, well, contact is really kind of the norm, don't you? And not something that's epiphenomenal.
And I'm curious if you can preview it for us a little bit. What contact you see in Proto-Germanic? Who is this contact with in Proto-Germanic?
Well, that I have no idea. Somebody was there. This was not empty space.
Sure. But I didn't
just
know
in
if
a
maybe you had
nutshell,
a sense of who that-
Indo-Europeans or pre-Germanic people migrated down into northern Germany, came into contact with whoever was there. I mean, that I wouldn't go so far as Teo to say it was Vasconians, but I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know that. But clearly, somebody was there, and we know that from the words that are not of non-Germanic or non-Indo-European origin, for like sea and things like that, eel, that took local names. There are river names and meadow names. Some of the older German guys that study this that are clearly not Indo-European. And given that context situation, I would say that there was like a kind of contact altered form of Indo-European that did away with a lot of the inflectional system, some of which of these systems that we reconstruct may have been secondary anyway. Edgar Ptolemy always thought that. And I think maybe he was right about this. So rather than this mass Indo-European structure that, Bruckmann and others of that era would have created, that, there was rather more modest. And anyway, coming in, a lot was wiped out or gotten rid of in contact with whoever was there along the North Sea. And then more Indo-Europeans came in, and basically you had what I call in this paper an exoteric variety of, say, pre-Germanic, which was much altered, that was used for within these groups. And then what developed was an esoteric insider variety, in which some of these paradigms that are etymologically opaque and different across the Germanic languages were rebuilt. And that's why you get the third week class looking either radically different or non-existent. It just didn't go there. The origin of the dental preterite, this was in the paper I gave. This is the one Joe dared me to give, but he felt it really turned out pretty well. Is also a function of that too. It's not something that was inherited, from Indo-European, but that was recreated. And then I'll go into the details in my talk there, but that's basically looking at two different types of Proto-Germanic. It certainly wasn't a monolith, in my opinion, that you did get a contact variety and then an overlay. And that's not unusual. That may seem weird from an Indo-European point of view, but I've been reading about some of the Melanesian languages and other languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, and that relationship is fundamental. If you look at Peter Milhäusler's book, Language Ecology in the Pacific, he has a very nice, that's where I reviewed that book for language years ago, and that's where I got, he said, maybe this whole Stammbaum idea of Indo-European is a very unique thing that's really region or area specific, and that this doesn't really apply very well to most of the rest of the world. Whereas from a European point of view, from an Indo-European point of view, well, how else would it be?
Right. And to clarify, when you're talking about the dental preterite in Germanic, for those who might.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
We're talking about basically the typical past tense formation in English, right? You're
right. Weighted, warten, wartete, as opposed to sing, sang, sung.
Right. And there's a long-standing notion that maybe that actually comes from a reduced form of the word did. Right.
That's right.
Effectively, it's walk, did.
Right.
Did. Yeah.
Right. But that's got all kinds of problems with it. I can't claim to be able to. It's another idea, but there join the club, I guess. But
Oh, so you
But-
don't see the do verb as being part of
no, I
the-
do not.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Was this also going to be in your upcoming paper? Something? Okay. All right. I'll look forward
Stay
to that.
tuned. This
I'll-
is still, as I said, I wasn't sure I was ready to even give it 6 years ago, but as I say, Joe said, come on.
Well, I
You
will
know,
say,
Joe,
Jim,
I mean,
I know Joe pretty well. Yeah. He is one of my heroes.
yeah, one of mine too.
He's the living embodiment of the phrase, if you want something done, ask a busy person.
Absolutely.
By
the way, somebody mentioned that I forgot Charlize Theron. I most certainly did. I didn't mention her as a well-known Afrikaans speaker, but I have in my Pidgin and Creole class, I have on Tuesdays Creole proverb of the day, and then on Thursdays the famous Creole phone of the day. And she was one of them in my class. And there's some really good clips of hers on YouTube of her speaking Afrikaans. So I mentioned Trevor, but he's the first one that came to mind. But definitely point taken. Thank you, Belle. You're absolutely correct. I could have mentioned her as well.
And I have to go in a few minutes.
I'm sorry. Okay, great.
If anyone wants to throw in like a quick question or comment at the end here. I know some people joined us as the conversation was in progress. I hope those of you who did were able to get something out of it without the previous parts. But before I upload this on YouTube, I'll also upload it privately on Vimeo for Patreon, so that those of you who maybe missed it will see it. I think maybe some people joined later because the original post that I made about this, it said it would start later than it did. That's my fault. At any rate, we've had a great conversation here, and I hope that we can have you back and give us
anytime
more about this, because there's clearly so much more to say.
I appreciate the invitation very, very much. I'm honored to be here.
So again, I am sorry to those who maybe got the wrong time for this, but I do have to go at this point. But I will upload this before it's uploaded to YouTube for Patreon, so you can see it if you missed it. Any other, you have any concluding remarks for us or recommendations about further reading we can go look at?
Oh, there's there is, if you're interested in Afrikaans, there's a book coming out. I have an article in, I mean, not just my article, it's worth it for a lot of others, called Contemporary Afrikaans Linguistics. This is at long last an updated English language handbook on Afrikaans linguistics. I've vetted several of the papers, so if you're interested, it's really, really very good. It's got everything from it goes beyond the sort of traditional mainstream views, let's say, in South Africa. It's an international group. Andres Kutsia on Argentina Afrikaans, also Teresa Bieberauer at Cambridge, a very distinguished syntactician who knows Afrikaans inside and out. So that would be good. For Creoles, oh gosh, all kinds of stuff. I can give you some basic. Let me ponder that, Jackson. I'll funnel something along that would be user friendly for the non-specialist.
Okay, I think Mufwene's work is actually often pretty readable.
I would go The Ecology of Language by Sally Mufwene. Yeah, very definitely. Sally's not the, all right. Sometimes he can be a bit, in terms of style, a bit difficult to kind of all over the place, but the ideas are definitely there. And he's somebody I also think put in Joe Salmons' league, as a scholar.
Sure, I've never met him, but he certainly seems to me to be in that league.
No, I totally support that.
All right. Well, and I have also learned an important lesson about another bug of Patreon, which is when I post announcements with one time, that's the form that's going to get emailed to everybody. So I need to just completely, instead of editing announcements, I need to just completely redo them. But that's my fault again.
Jackson, one of your one of your people says maybe there should be an old Norse language monument.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm not gonna make
Wait,
it.
why
I
not?
don't know how to make things besides, I mean, but it's a fun idea. I'm sure someone will have the plans in mind somewhere. Okay, again,
Okay.
my apologies to folks who missed the time change. I need to just make totally new announcements when that happens, and we'll have you back. And this will be posted on Patreon for folks to watch before it's on YouTube. And for now, I'm gonna have to wish everybody all the best.